Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. It's been a wonderful gathering. I'm enjoying it very much. And I wanted to thank the organizers for not only for the conference and for inviting me, but also for letting me talk about something else, not about what I usually talk about. So I think I was actually invited because I have this speech about Bayesianism and rationality and how it is irrational to be Bayesian when you don't have enough information and all that. But at some point, I think that some people in the audience have heard this talk too many times, and suddenly I've given it too many times. And I started thinking that I might be boring myself, because the only way I could be excited about it is if there would be, by some chance, people who believe that Bayesianism is rational, but it is such a low probability event. So, Tony, this is for you. Yesterday morning, David Schmeidler sent me this link that he got from this automatic, your paper has been cited. So this is a paper in Nature, okay, that came out this year, I guess pretty recently. I don't have connection here, so I don't have the entire thing, but I guess I have a witness that I just downloaded this abstract. And I want to highlight this. So they check the relationship between sensitivity to ambiguity was lower in individuals who met diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. Together, these data suggest that alterations in cost-benefit decision-making may promote antisocial behavior. Tony, I think you've read enough lingo to mean that you Bayesians are a bunch of criminals. This is the bottom line. Okay. But, you know, so what I'm actually going to talk about today is a little different. So, but it is related. So let me try to say in what way it is related. Okay. Okay. So the general project, actually this is a combination of two different projects. One is a much longer one that I've been doing with David Schmeidler for 3 decades, embarrassing to admit. And this is the question about, you know, Bayesianism or not, and alternatives, and when is it rational? And part of what we've been doing, maybe you shouldn't be reading this yet. So part of what David and I have been doing is to try to look into the belief formation process with 2 goals, actually. One is to say, okay, suppose that you're Bayesian. Suppose that you buy Savage's axioms, whether normatively or descriptively. I don't want to get into this because this makes sense in both stories. Which priors should you pick up? Whether you ask yourself, what is the right thing for me? Or whether you ask yourself as an economist, what do these people out there believe? You want to know how they generate these beliefs. Okay? This is combined with the question of when our beliefs are the right thing to do. Because if we look at the belief formation process, then we might understand when does it work and give us nice probabilistic beliefs, and when we might need to go beyond that and say, maybe they don't have well-defined beliefs. So trying to look at the process is something that we've been doing for a while, and the longer thing has been case-based. Namely believing that people look at similar past cases, and there'll be a couple of formulas in a minute. There's also some work on rule-based. Together with Larry Samuelson, we have a project that tries to look at unified models of case-based reasoning and rule-based reasoning. The general approach is the same. Let's look at how beliefs are formed, and then if it so happens that they end up being probabilistic, that's wonderful, but we might also delineate the scope of the reasonability of the Bayesian model while doing so. The other project is something that Rossella Argentiano and I have been looking at for some time. We haven't worked on it nearly as much as on the previous one, but this is about coordination games with a focus on social phenomena such as revolutions, wars, things like financial crisis, basically equilibrium selection problems. So this was basically the equilibrium selection in coordination games was the main thing of Rossella's dissertation at Yale. And we've been looking at it from a case-based point of view with the idea that when we are facing a coordination game such as a revolution or a financial crisis or something like that, if I want to understand which equilibrium is going to be selected, maybe I want to look at history, and history is going to be some kind of a coordination device or some kind of a focal point, if you will, for generating beliefs about the equilibrium in the game. And then what's typical of coordination game is that there are self-fulfilling prophecies. So if we all believe that there's going to be a revolution, probably it's going to succeed. If we all believe that there's no chance for a revolution, probably no one's going to take to the streets, and things of this nature. The approach that we're looking at in terms of looking at past cases and how similar they are, and in particular the second-order induction I'm going to talk about today, can be applied also to phenomena that do not involve humans. And actually, with David Schmeidler and Ofer Lieberman, who's basically a time series econometrician, we have this project of taking this machinery just as a statistical technique. We even ran it on data, comparing it to logistic regression. So some of the formulas I'm talking about today can certainly be viewed as just a statistical technique, not modeling anyone, no humans or anything like that. The focus of this talk is taking basically the same machinery as a model of human reasoning. Okay? And when we think about the kind of how does this hopefully relates to this conference, I want to talk about the estimation of risk of these kind of things like wars, revolutions, and things like that. And I want to say that in some sense we're in a much worse position here than we are with the, say, climate change problems. Because while climate change is very difficult conceptually, at least you have physics behind you. Okay? If I'm trying to understand what Kim Jong-il is going to do, I don't have the basic science that you have with climates and glaciers. Okay? The basic thing that I would like to have there are psychology, and if I were to ask psychologists what Kim Jong-il is going to do, we all know that the answer we're going to get is going to be very qualified, right? Basically, we don't know, right? So in some sense, many of these uncertainties that we are looking at, and there could be wars, there could be revolutions, there could be financial crisis, the underlying science that's supposed to help us is not nearly as advanced or as reliable as the natural sciences. So in some sense, conceptually, we are on a shakier ground there. Well, in any event, we'll try to look at this as a model of how people think about it. So the basic idea is that people look at the history to generate beliefs for the future. But importantly, what we're trying to say here that's sort of new relative to what we've done earlier, and this is to say that the way that we look at the past also changes endogenously. And this is what we call second-order induction. So when I say first-order induction, for the purposes of this talk, I mean that we look at past cases and assume that the future is going to be like the past. But we do it with some similarity. Okay, so if I go to my doctor and I say, okay, what's my probability of surviving the operation, then she might say, well, 70% of the people do survive. But then I ask, talking about men or women, people over or under 50, etc. So more similar people should have a higher weight in the empirical frequency. So that's the first-order induction. Second-order induction would refer to the process by which my doctor presumably figured out what's important and what's less important, right? She's not going to condition on my first name. Okay? We all feel that this is probably not important for medical outcomes, but age and heart condition, etc., might be. And if I were to ask my doctor, why do you take this into account, she would probably say, experience has shown that this is an important feature. And that's what we call second-order induction, namely the process by which I use the same data to learn which features are and more or less important. And in this talk, we're going to talk about Bayesian people. So the question is just how to come up with probabilistic beliefs with this process. Okay? Just a bit of formula to be slightly more concrete. So we'll be talking about a standard learning regression, machine learning problem, whatever you want to call it. So we have a random variable that we want to estimate. Everything here is going to be binary. In the project with Ofer Lieberman, we did things in continuous variables, but the theoretical results are easier for us to prove in the binary case. So we have these predicting variables. Again, in this talk, they're going to be binary, but in general, you could think about it more generally. And if I ask you for a new point xp, what is the probability that y is going to be 1 versus 0, what you do is basically the empirical frequency. How many times have I seen 1 as opposed to zeros? But each observation is being weighted by its similarity to the current one. So this is basically kernel, what's known as kernel probabilities in statistics. When David Schmeiler and I started working on this in a slightly different model that turned out to be equivalent to kernel classification. Then with Antoine Biot and Dov Summit, we have something that does this. Well, not exactly this. With Ofer Lieberman, we do it in a binary case. With Antoine Biot and Dov Summit in the case of more than 2, which is actually ends up being much more elegant in the case of more than 2 outcomes. But this is basically kernel probabilities. I'm mentioning in passing something that I find quite exciting, and this is that there are many things that you find both in psychology and in statistics, and that we find some amazing coincidence. So David and I came to this with some very vague idea of what people think, how people might be thinking, trying to play with the simplest formula that we could axiomatize. But maybe it's not too surprising that this formula existed in psychology, because that's where our intuition was, and psychologists have been much more sophisticated in that. So at least, the first round, you could expect to see the same formula there. What was surprising is that time after time, we found that the same formula existed in statistics. And it's a bit of a surprise, because psychologists just want to tell us how people think. It's purely descriptive. And statisticians are supposed to show us what's the right way to think about the data, right? So there's some convergence between the two. And by the way, even the mistakes sometimes do converge. Gabrielle Geyer did her PhD on Tel Aviv, and she was trying to explain Kahneman-Tversky's distortion function with, everyone knows this, I guess, right, that smaller probabilities get magnified, right? And she had a case-based explanation based on the idea that when you look at a probability number, maybe you know it very well, like 50-50, you know what it means. But if it's another number, you try to go back to cases that had similar numbers there. And then she could find this function, and actually it makes a lot of sense, because if you see a very small number and you ask yourself which are the similar numbers that you've seen, you see more numbers on the right than on the left, because there aren't so many numbers left of 0. Okay? So this is sort of a simple result, that you get the function to be above the 45 degrees line at 0. At some point, she was presenting it somewhere, and a concentration says, so what are you telling us, that kernel functions have problems on the boundaries? We know that. Okay? So what is well known as a statistical problem for kernel functions happened to be the mistake that Kahneman-Tversky found that humans make. So even when these things don't work, they even don't work in similar ways. Now, you could take a very optimistic or a very pessimistic view of this. I mean, the optimistic view is to say, look at how wonderful evolution is. It gave us these wonderful brains. Or if you don't want evolution, take something else. You could make it whoever gave us the brain, gave us a brain that works so fantastically well, just like statistics and machine learning. You could take a more pessimistic view and say, look at these statisticians. They haven't come up with anything that doesn't exist in their brains anyway. But anyway, the formula is very basic and very simple, okay? And the question that we want to ask is, where is the similarity function coming from? Okay, so we have...
Have you defined the S function? Am I supposed to know what S is, this S function?
No, okay, so in the axiomatic approach, just like you say, Savage says, if you are coherent in this and this way, then you should behave as if you have a probability. Then we come to Savage and say, come on, but he didn't tell us which probability. So we delve into this and we axiomatize the relationship between a database and your beliefs. And then I say, if you are sufficiently coherent, if your mapping from databases to belief is sufficiently consistent, it is as if there is a similarity function such that these are your beliefs. Okay? And then you should say, wonderful, okay, so you convinced me that this is a reasonable way to generate beliefs. But then the question is, which similarity function should we find? Okay? So in some sense, it seems that we transformed the question of where is the prior coming from to where is the similarity function coming from. So actually we had a paper with Antoine Biot where we said, okay, let's try to look at this a bit more. Assuming you're using this kind of formula, what would make sense? And we axiomatized there a similarity function that is exponential in a norm. Okay? So we assume that the x's are in some rk, and there exists a norm such that the similarity is the negative exponent of that. But then you should come and say, but where is the norm coming from? So you keep, and the answer is, look, there's so much I can do by writing things on the whiteboard. Okay? Eventually, it's going to be an empirical question. So if I ask my doctor, why do you think that blood pressure is important and first names are not important, the answer would be, well, experience showed that. So the idea of the empirical similarity is this, the idea that it's trying to say, let's see which similarity function would have explained the database given on that. So this is the statistical technique that we've sort of worked on with Ofer Lieberman. What we're doing in this paper is take the very same idea as an actual model of how people think about this kind of phenomena. Okay? Okay. Maybe I should, okay, well, I should maybe go ahead and show you the examples, and then I'll actually do I'll skip the highlight of the results and just do the model. So let me explain why we think that this is some kind of second-order induction is a reasonable model of how people think about such social phenomena that we can think of as coordination games. So let's take the first example would be the election of President Obama, of Obama to be the first non-white president. So it was a huge thing. I think some of my other examples are going to be even older, and some of you might not know them. But this is something that I hope you remember. There was lots of excitement when Obama was elected. And the feeling that this was a very important precedent, that something dramatic changed. Okay. Now, when I think about someone running for office, it is a coordination game of sorts. Okay? I mean, not volunteer for someone who has no chance. I would probably, as a donor, I would not give money to someone who has no chance. I need to believe that the candidate is a credible candidate. And one thing that changed dramatically is the fact that an African American was never elected before. You know, the U.S. had, 43 presidents before him, and even if you limit it to post-World War II, I think there were about 11 before Obama, I think I counted. None of them was an African American. Okay? So if I take the empirical frequency idea and suppose that now a young guy who happens to be African American says, I want to be president, he has this precedent to look up to, right? But if I were to look at just the empirical frequencies, I don't think this will capture the story. Okay? Because if with Obama, let's say post-World War II, you have one African American out of 12, as opposed to 0 out of 11, yes, that's definitely a difference. But a feeling that much more is going on. It's not the difference between 1 out of 12 as opposed to 0. Okay? And what we'll try to argue is that the dramatic thing that changed is that when people look at it, they say, race doesn't matter. Okay? Because if I'm doing, as a person observing this process, and I'm asking myself, which are the variables that are going to help me predict which candidate has a better chance than not, then if all of my candidates were white men, then I'll think that this is probably important. And my empirical similarity, which is something I don't expect people to actually compute, but sort of intuitively have a grasp that everyone has been a white man so far, so probably this is going to be a very helpful thing for me to predict who has a chance to win. But once I have this counterexample, maybe this variable is not so helpful in my prediction and I drop it out. Okay? So what we try to argue is that the importance of precedent is not only in the change of the empirical frequencies, but also in the way that these empirical frequencies are being used, namely in the similarity function. Okay, I have about half an hour from, I think so. Okay, thanks. Okay, example 2 is something that I used to think is current affairs, but I understand it's more like history. But so let me tell you, young guys, what happened. Okay, so 1988, the fall of. We don't want to talk about the fall of the Soviet bloc. So there was some unrest in Poland. Lech Walesa was prominent in the shipyards. And Poland was the first country to break free, and the USSR, to a large extent to the surprise of most people, just let it happen. Okay, so as opposed to the previous cases of Hungary in '56 and Czechoslovakia in '68, Poland broke free. And then in a matter of months, all of the USSR satellites broke free. Okay, so Poland was an important exception and precedent, and after this, country by country in the Soviet bloc decided to become a free democratic state, and the USSR let it happen. And this, well, there were some fights. If in Romania, it wasn't so easy, etc. But eventually, it was basically the Soviet bloc disintegrated, but not the USSR. Okay. The USSR remained a sovereign state for 2 more years. And what this means, I would say that if you are part of, say, the Baltics, and maybe you also want to be a free state, and you say, well, why not Poland? Look at Poland, look at Czechoslovakia. And the answer is, well, you are not Poland, because you are part of the USSR, your language is Russian, and you teach Russian at school, and you pay in rubles. Okay, so that's not the same thing. We're talking about the similarity function. Okay, so Czechoslovakia and Romania, etc., were similar to Poland because they were just satellites of the USSR, and they were similar to each other, and it was obvious to everyone that what happened in Poland can happen in Czechoslovakia. That's not true of Latvia. Okay? So if I'm a Latvian citizen, I want to have a revolution, I ask myself, is it a good idea to take to the streets, or am I going to find myself in jail? I'm trying to predict the outcome of this thing, and the experience of Poland and Czechoslovakia, with all due respect, is not so relevant to me because we're not sufficiently similar. Okay? And this was kept this way for 2 more years, until the Baltics were the first to break free. I actually remember Gorbachev trying to convince them not to, talking to demonstrators, but they did. And once the Baltics went free, the USSR broke up completely. Okay? So what happened, basically, in our language, I would say this property, this attribute of the similarity function, namely being part of the USSR, was still considered to be important, that it set apart the precedents of Poland and Czechoslovakia from what would happen to the 15 republics. But once Latvia and Lithuania were free, why not Kazakhstan? Why not the rest? Okay? And in no time, the USSR broke free. If I were a Chechen, I could think maybe us too. Why not? Okay? But it's not so obvious, because Chechnya is part of Russia proper, of the Republic of Russia. It's not a separate, not part of the Federation. Okay? Now, should Chechnya break free too, should it secede from Russia, it would mean that even being part of Russia is not important anymore. And apparently this is something that the Russian government could not afford, because this would have been the disintegration of the state. And this is where the Russian government decided to fight. And we all know that they did not let the Chechens break free, and this was pretty bloody and pretty sad, but the Chechens were not. So in our language, I would say that this was basically a battle of the similarity function. Okay, so we had this consecutive change of the similarity, because it's all about coordination games. But at the beginning, everyone thought that if you're part of the USSR, you have no chance, giving 56 and 68. Then you saw that it doesn't really matter, so people dropped this thing from the similarity judgment. Then being part of the USSR is no longer important, but being part of Russia is important to this day. Okay? So it's what precedents are doing is changing the way that we look at the similarity functions. One last example, and then we'll go into the results. And this is change of currency, which at least in the case of Israel, which I happen to know, was made twice in an attempt to stop inflation. Okay, so no more war, no more bloodshed. So now we're talking about just plain economics, but it's still a coordination game. Okay? Because if we have a situation where you have inflation, prices go up, the government has to print more money, and then everyone knows that prices go up, and if the inflation rates go up, then everyone raises their prices because they know that the money is worth less. So we are in this kind of spiral where, let's say, constant inflation rate, we just keep updating the prices by a certain cost. This has, of course, a lot of cost because it's not known, uncertainty, blah, blah, blah. So the government wants to stop this. And the government wants to come to the public and say, come on, let's just stop this thing. Whatever the currency is worth right now, it's going to be that. We're not going to print anymore. We're going to keep it, and the price is going to be stable. And that's another equilibrium. If prices are stable, prices are stable. I'm not going to increase my prices if I know that prices are stable because I just lose my share of the market. Okay? So the question is, can we move from one equilibrium that is not so, that has the cost of inflation to another equilibrium in which inflation is low? Now, things that have been done, and so there was a currency change in France in 1960, and in Israel, this was already, in my time, there were two changes. So in 1980, what used to be the Israeli lira, 10 Israeli liras became a shekel. Okay, and this was supposed to be, in our language, this was using the similarity function, actually the perceptual similarity, as a way to signal that this is something new. We are moving from an equilibrium of inflation to equilibrium of low or zero inflation. Okay? And to convince you that something new is going on, the government was using something very perceptual, which is the currency. It had a different name, much less zeros, or at least one less zero in this case, etc. Interestingly enough, it didn't help. Okay, so in the early 80s, Israel went from inflation to hyperinflation. And actually, the government repeated this trick 5 years later, this time deleting no less than 3 zeros and succeeding. Okay? Now, the way the government succeeded, it was a national unity government, and they could actually control their expenses, so the budget was balanced more or less. And okay, so there was fiscal policy behind it that actually helped to change. What I'm trying to say is that I'd like to argue that people are sufficiently rational to compute the empirical similarity here. What do I mean by that? The first time that the Israeli government changed the currency, it was basically trying to jump to a new equilibrium, to say, hey, this is not where we're not the inflation equilibrium, now we're moving to zero inflation equilibrium. But as the government kept spending, which meant spending money didn't have, and inflation kept going up, and people realized it doesn't really matter whether it's called a lira or a shekel. Okay, it's just a name. What's in a name? Okay, the inflation keeps going up. So even though there is a lot of power to the perceptual thing, okay, and you can think of other perceptual things like changing your capital, changing your flag, or things like this, people generally would be rational enough to look at the data and say, well, symbols, but it's basically the same thing, dropping the name of the currency from the similarity function. Second time around, the new Israeli shekel, 3 less zeros, but also with some change in behavior, then the similarity function, the empirical similarity function, the more rational one, could support the perceptual one, and this indeed helped to basically stop inflation until today. So these are the kind of phenomena we want to talk about, and now let's see what we can say about it. I should say that in the formal model, we're not talking about the game. It's going to be always in the background, and we're just going to talk about the statistical problem of finding the best similarity. So we don't have much smart to say about the actual game, so just think of these probabilities that we use the similarity for are eventually used to select an equilibrium. So we have a set of predictors is this set of just m predictors. These are the variables. In this paper, they're all going to be binary, so just vector of 0, 1. So is y. The one we're trying to predict is in 0, 1. The prediction problem has a database, so just a collection of these and a new case. And the question is, what's this? So we've seen this formula before. Just for the sake of the argument, because it's okay. We'll have completed to 0 if it's not well defined. 0.5 if the denominator is 0. In this paper, we're doing something very simplistic and assume that the similarity function is binary. It takes only values in 0 and 1. Evidently symmetric, but importantly transitive. Importantly, I'm saying because it's highly unrealistic. Okay. So the way we define the similarity is just 1 or 0, but it's basically defining an equivalence relation. So it's just a matter of asking myself which variables am I looking at, and those variables that I'm looking at divide my database into, if I'm looking at k of them, 2 to the k bins. Okay? Now, the fact that the similarity function is symmetric is something I'm not too bothered by. There's works by Amos Tversky that show that it's not, but I would say that's probably on the less rational one. Okay? So if someone thinks that Canada is more similar to the US and the US to Canada, I think we can walk them through this and convince them it's not the right way to do it. The fact that the similarity function here is transitive, of course, is highly idealized. A blue circle is similar to a blue rectangle, and a blue rectangle is similar to a red rectangle, but okay, so it doesn't make much sense that the similarity function would be like this. There is a concept of multiplicative transitivity in psychology that actually came out from the triangle inequality when we did this norm thing. So it's a very highly idealized thing. We just may take the simplest model that conveys some ideas. I'm not trying to say this is realistic. Okay. What is the optimal similarity function, or the empirical one? What we're going to do is just do in-sample fitting, which is the leave one out technique. So basically what we're doing, so cross-validation with leave one out. So for each observation I, we're looking for a given similarity function. We ask what would have been the prediction of this yi had I taken this one out and used the other variables to predict this one. Just cross-validation. And what we're trying to do is minimize the sum of squared errors. So the or a similarity function that minimizes this is going to be called the or an empirical similarity. Okay? So you see, I want to say something about uniqueness. Mean squared error is just going to be this divide by something else. I'm just going to identify the similarity function by the set of variables that define it, because things are very simple here. And in order to deal with overfitting, we're going to do something like an adjusted R square. We're going to make you pay for additional variables. 10 minutes or 12? Okay, good. So the first thing we want to point out is that, and this is a little bit different from linear regression, here you might not want to use all the variables even if you're only looking at in sample, just in terms of fitting your sample. Even before you start thinking about overfitting and your out-of-sample prediction, you might already have reasons to select a smaller set of predictors when you're looking at the in-sample. This is a bit of a ridiculous example. We'll see two ways in which it's ridiculous in a few minutes, and then we'll have a positive result. But if this is your database, one variable that is your predictor, and this is what you're trying to predict, and obviously they're uncorrelated and nothing works here, then with the empty database, you're going to get better prediction than with this one. This is partly has to do with the leave one out technique that has this problem. I mean, if I'm using x1 and I'm looking at the bin defined by x1 being 0, I get 0 and 1. And this is the worst thing that can happen to me, because if I take 1 out, so I take the 0 out, I'm predicting 1 when it's actually 0 and vice versa. So having a bin with 0 and 1 is the worst that can happen to me. And the other thing that happens here is that x doesn't really tell me much about y. So to deal with the first issue, we don't want to have too small bins, so you can think about some notion of replication. Okay? So this is, I mean, the definition looks messy, but the idea is you should just copy the database t times. And if you copy the database t times, then this effect of leave one out is going to be smaller. You would still, in this case, prefer the empty set to the set 1. You would still get better prediction with no variables than with this single variable. Okay, thank you. But as you can see, these two things converge to the same thing. This is a half square and a half square, so the effect of this, what was pretty pronounced there, is going to disappear if the database is large relative to my variables. Yes, please.
So no variable means you use the entire partition.
Yep.
So why are you worried about it? That would be some other kind of built-in hedge against overfit without being explicitly designed that way.
Yeah.
Well, this effect basically says you punish these very small bins, which is a penalty for overfitting.
More like a curse of dimensionality. Overfitting would be when you go out of sample.
Yeah, okay.
But this is already inside sample.
Why, at this point, Why is it a problem? I mean, you could just leave the model and say, okay, that's one feature.
Oh, it's not a problem of the model. I'm just saying it's a feature of the model that you might want to have smaller sets of predictors even before worrying about overfitting.
You might, but okay.
Yeah. Okay. So we're asking, how general it is. Okay. The other thing that happens here in this example, for which even if you replicate a database, X doesn't help you, is that it's just completely uninformative. So if I look at this is a bit more general here, but because I'm looking at a variable, suppose that you already have a set of predictors, and I'm asking, is it useful to add little lowercase j to the set? And the answer is there exists at least one bin defined by these sets, the variables you already have, such that the average is different, then it's a little bit informative. Okay? And these two things together would be enough, so that, it's not a very profound result, but if you have a j that is informative relative to the set of predictors you already have, and if you allow me to replicate the database enough, and I'll try to talk when I have 5 minutes or so, what I mean by that, what's the meaning, I think, of this, what's the importance of that, then eventually you would want to include it in. This is just the MSE. This is not, I'm not charging you for adding the variable. I'm just asking, will it do better on the in sample? I'm not before the extra costs, okay? Vice versa, it's almost the same. If j is not informative, then you don't gain by this. The MSE is not going down. And this would be strict unless, of course, lowercase j is already a function of what you have, in which case the bins are exactly the same bins. Okay, that's not very profound. We also see here non-uniqueness. This is why I was trying to emphasize the or n empirical similarity, because there is no guarantee that the similarity function that minimizes the MSE is going to be a unique one. So we don't have to go through this. But one result that I think is saying something about it is the following. And we think that okay, let me back up for a second. It's easy to generate examples of non-uniqueness because we're in a binary model. So I guess in the back of your mind, you're saying, oh, yeah, sure, okay. You have a binary model, so but probably a zero probability event. But what we do know from the statistical work that we've been doing with Ofer Lieberman, et cetera, is that it's really hard to compute the similarity function. What we were doing on real databases with continuous variables, we were just running MATLAB. And depending on your initial conditions, MATLAB would come up with different optimal similarity functions. So the problem is highly non-convex. Our suspicion that it has a very rugged terrain and that it's very difficult to optimize. Okay? This is just our empirical observation from the way we try to fit database. What I can say theoretically is only in the binary case. In the binary case, what I can say, it is a computationally hard problem to find the best set of predictors. Okay? So what is the empirical similarity problem? You're given the size and the database of size with the m variable in size n. I'm giving you the cost. C is the cost for the additional variable, and R is what the fit I want you to get. And I'm asking you, is there a similarity function? Is there a subset of variables such that your adjusted mean squared error does not exceed R? And the result says that this is an NP-complete problem. Okay? So where the computational complexity stems from the fact that you have different subsets of variables to compute. What we'd like to say, so NP-complete meaning, of course, it's hard to do. No one can solve it optimally. But also, the reason I like to use this NP-completeness as a metaphor when I think about how people think is to say it's hard to solve, even though it's easy to verify. Okay, so if I were to show you the set of variables, you would say, oh, yes, sure, you explain the data very well. But a priori, it's going to be difficult for me to do. So apart from the technicalities of this, when I'm thinking of this as a metaphor of how people think, I think this is going to be a difficult problem. And the reason that we put it here is to say, even if you were in the back of your mind thinking about something continuous or something, and the uniqueness result, while being a knife edge in a binary case, might seem knife edge because of a binary case, probably saying that even if there is a unique function, people need not find it. Okay, there's another thing which is sort of related to overfitting. And now for this result, it's very simple, but I want to state it because it says if you fix the size of your database and you keep getting more and more predictors, you should expect there to be more than one. I mean, this non-uniqueness result is going to be generic. With probability 1, you're going to get actually 2 columns. Each one of them gives you a perfect fit. Okay. So what are we doing with this? So let me just do this one and then talk about what science is. So one application, going back to the reputation stuff we talked about, whether the Soviet Union is going to crush a rebellion, yes or no, or something like this. You are new, this is a toy model in which there are cases in which there are ones and zeros, successes or failures. And you're a new, you haven't been there, you're a new player on the stage. Okay, so this is your proper name. Say you're the new dean and you want to change the rules and you want to convince everyone that this is you are important. The fact that you are now the dean changes the rules of the game. And we're asking with K1s and L0s under your regime, okay, for every number of, say, no's or failures or whatever, how many times do you have to insist on a yes to convince people that you're different? Okay, so you want to generate a reputation for saying the regime, my regime is different from the previous ones. How much would you have to work on this? This is just to, but the main point is that if you start with nothing, 2 cases would be enough. If you allowed yourself even once to allow things go as they used to, then you'll have to work at least 5. So if you think of it as, how many rebellions you need to crush, think about, the Arab Spring and how costly it was for Assad to convince people that he's not like Gaddafi and so on. I have 2 more minutes? Okay. So this is trying to capture this and trying to say that with this similarity function, it's easy to explain why when you're coming to a relatively fresh start, you don't have to work as hard to establish reputation than if you doing it later on, and why it took Assad so long to explain to the world that he's not going to leave the scene so soon. Okay? Because Assad had this experience of Libya, Tunisia, it seemed like he's going to go very fast. Okay, the main thing I want to talk about, just the last 2 minutes, is this issue of M. So what I think matters here to a large degree in terms of the bottom line of uniqueness and complexity and so on is which grows faster, N or M? Okay, what do I mean by this? If I toss a coin and I ask you what is going to determine the toss of the coin, there are so many variables that you can think of that can possibly matter. Okay, it's going to be the temperature maybe and the angle and things like this, but you take so many variables and it's easy to experiment. You can have many experiments with this, so N can grow very far. M is relatively small, so all this complexity is not such a big deal. Even 2 to the M, if M is 3, 2 to the M is something we can live with. N is large, eventually we can find the empirical similarity. It's likely to be unique, we'll all converge on it. This is what we call science. By contrast, when I think about, say, the Arab Spring, or if I think about the Soviet Union collapsing, or about currency change, there are only so many cases that are there. Okay? I cannot experiment at will. Okay? I cannot decide to have another experimentation of the revolution in Syria, nor another USSR. By contrast, M is very large, because we can sit here and conjure up thousands of variables that might matter. We can think about social aspects. We can think about religion. We can think about, when you think about economic growth, think about the variety of variables that are being mentioned, including the type of regime and the colonial power and the religion of the colonial power and things like that. So if I have a relatively small n, because I cannot generate new revolutions or new wars, they are just there. This is history. But I can conjure up more and more variables. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised that people have different beliefs. Okay? So sort of agreeing to disagree kind of things can be quite natural if we're looking at a given history about which many stories can be told, many variables can be there. So it shouldn't be too surprising maybe that when we cannot experiment, when we cannot do proper science, then we have so many different theories about how to explain history. I'm done. Thanks.
It's a very naive question. So a lot of these examples are sort of familiar to me from causal Bayes network type analysis, where I feel like they're after a very similar kind of issue, in the sense that there's this sort of double induction problem. There's, you want to you fix your causal graph, you've got some data, you make a prediction, you get a new observation, and then part of it is just changing the prediction, but there's also the second order effect where you think, well, actually maybe I haven't got this causal graph quite right. This is telling me something about the graph as well. But in this framework, it's explicitly causal, and it's not quite clear, I guess, whether similarity information is being used in this or not. I guess I don't. So I'm just wondering whether, I mean, it's a sort of open question. I mean, whether you see what you're doing as very different from sort of causal-based type analysis, a generalization because you don't make any explicit causal references?
Right. So we are silent on the causal issues. It's in sense it's closer to regression analysis, okay, in which we're mostly focusing on the correlations here, where also this kind of learning takes place. By the way, I should say that many of our examples could be told in the language of rules. Like, you know, associative rules saying if you are the Soviet Union, then you don't let countries break free. And then once you have a precedent, you say the rule doesn't work anymore, which is, so the rule is your first order induction, and learning which rules fit the data is the second order induction. So yes, much of it is much more general, it can be told in various languages. And by the way, there is an older paper with Enriqueta Aragones, Andy Postlethwaite, and David Schmeiler. We have a similar completeness, NP completeness result for the regression problem. I mean, yeah, I think some of these principles are much more general than what we do here. The focus on the case-based here is, to us, seems natural. I mean, actually, we're not comparing it so much. We haven't been thinking about causal networks, Bayesian networks. We've been thinking about regression, that it just seems like a natural. Empirical frequencies seem very simple. There are, by the way, models that use regression analysis, like Bray had this model in '82 to use regression analysis as a model of how the agents think. Okay, so we're sort of along these lines. But perhaps the same thing can be told in the language of Bayesian networks. It's not, I'm not going to be committed. It just seems to be like a very simple model that goes one step away from empirical frequency. You always have probabilities, cases do not contradict each other. So it's something relatively very basic and simple-minded. You know, just you look at the empirical frequencies, you just put a bit more, and this could be a model of how children think, including, by the way, the second order. I didn't get to it, but we argue that children also learn the similarity function, if you will. Okay, so it's something very, very simple-minded.
I'm a little confused. From your preamble, you seem to be suggesting you were going to say something that was a problem for Bayesianism. Was that just?
You know, just because you're here, no.
Okay, so this is not any of this supposed to be a problem for me.
No, no.
Oh, good.
No,
okay, because it clearly wasn't. Okay, thank you.
No, so generally, I mean, I was. No, so coming here, I thought that everyone would be already enlightened. So I mean, I didn't know that we'll have to argue about Bayesianism still. No, but this is just to a bit more seriously. So I think Bayesianism is a great model. I think it's also a great model of how people think. I think it's a great model even of how cats think. You know, some kind of Bayesian reasoning. The original Bayes idea of you know, proving is the intelligent design argument, right? To prove that God exists because of the world as it is, I think is very powerful. And in fact, I would say that this is what we see in miracles in the Bible. Okay, God is very explicit in the Bible. When God is talking to Abraham, he's trying to show and say, "I'll do this and this, so that you would know that I am your God." Okay, so you have this model of either there is God or not, or your God is stronger than other gods, and then there is the miracle. And what God expects you to do is the Bayesian reasoning to say, "Oh, if this were not God, it would be very unlikely that this and this would happen." Okay. So this Bayesian reasoning, I think, is with us since days of yore, and in the Bible it's even quite explicit. I mean, it's not in formulas, but it's quite explicit that this cause would not have been here unless you've had this effect. So I have nothing against Bayesian reasoning as a wonderful benchmark and a model of how people think. What happens within our community is that people become religious about it. Okay, with or without miracles, they believe that this is the only way to think rationally about things. And when it comes to you know, Kim Jong-il, I would prefer that the decision makers who make decisions for my children are not going to come up with a Bayesian prior out of nowhere. Okay, I think it's going to be irresponsible to pretend that you know probabilities when you don't. It's not that the Bayesian model is not good. It's fantastic. The question is it the be-all and end-all? And when you don't have data, do you still insist on using it? Now, part of what I'm saying here about N and M has to do with that, because if you have an ability to experiment, if you can do what is, I think, the hallmark of science is to go back to something which is more or less the same conditions and experiment, you collect a larger N for the same M and hopefully causally unrelated in some intuitive sense, then why not generate beliefs? You could probably have probabilistic beliefs. If you have so many examples like wars or revolutions or dictators that you have in the past, let's say 4 relevant examples, and about each one of them there are so many variables and you cannot experiment, that's where I consider the Bayesian approach somewhat suspicious, or let's say I want to see exactly where is the prior coming from and to allow for the possibility that maybe there won't be a unique prior.
We have one brief question.
A question about the interpretation of this disagreement proposition. Understand it better in the regression context. It could be the NP completeness result doesn't say kind of how people get stuck at local optima. One suspicion in the regression case, and I think here it's similar, would be that they are close to the maximum.
Yep.
But there are many ways to be close to the maximum.
Exactly, yeah.
If they are close to the maximum, then they would have used different regressors, but would make very similar predictions.
In sample.
In sample, but of course, if they stay...
But then comes something new and they can...
If they keep staying close to the maximum, that would have to be out of the sample as well.
But at a given point of time, then again, the question is how large is N and how large is M? So if N is the next financial crisis, so we are analyzing financial crisis in 29 and 87 and 07, and now we can have very different beliefs about the next financial crisis. So again, if we're just tossing a coin, I'd say fine. So you're at a local optimum, I'm at a local optimum. Let's toss the coin a few more times and we'll converge. No problem. I don't think we have so much disagreement there. But when we are asking, what are the deep reasons for growth or things like this, maybe we can be at a disagreeing, okay, on the out of sample.